With less than a week until the deadline on December the 15th, Beijing and Washington are widely expected to hammer out a partial trade deal. But that's according only to the analyst. Recent events may throw a monkey wrench into a deal, much as impeachment hearings on the U.S. president and unwelcome U.S. intervention in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Could these weigh heavily on China-U.S. trade talks? Can they keep trade talks on track? Before we get down to a discussion about all of this with our panelists, take a look at this first.
The next few days will be a crucial time for China-U.S. trade talks. New U.S. tariffs are set to go into force on December 15th, which would impose new levies on the remaining $300 billion of Chinese goods to the U.S. As the deadline approaches, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said trade talks with China are on track, with deputy negotiators from both countries holding calls as they actively work toward a deal. The next day, the Chinese government says it's working to remove tariffs on American soybeans and pork. But the threat of impeachment looms over U.S. President Donald Trump. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said formal impeachment proceedings against him could begin. Mr. Trump is not only accused of what she called misconduct on a historic scale over his interaction with Ukraine, but also politicians and media from different countries have condemned U.S. meddling in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Just a week after the United States passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, there is a similar bill on another Chinese territory, Xinjiang. The House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Act of 2019 on December 3. As a whole, this has led to uncertainty over China-U.S. relations. The upcoming week will prove to be the crucible of U.S.-China trade ties, be it for better or for worse.
So, how are trade talks shaping up between China and the United States? Are we going to have some kinds of so-called phase one result before the end of the year? Let's go to our panelists in our Beijing studio. We have Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Also joining us in Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Ann Ashton, Director of Business Advisory Services of U.S.-China Business Council. Last but not least, we also have from Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, former Deputy U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our discussion. We have a big panel and certainly a strong one. Let me ask you, Ms. Ashton, since you are the closest to the trade community, the business community, do you think the two sides, when it comes to trade talks, will be not disturbed by other events besides what's going on in the trade and economic issues?
I certainly think it's a testament to the importance that both sides have placed on trying to resolve the trade issues, that all of these other factors, the political factors that are going on domestically and in the bilateral relationship, have so far seemed to be kept separate from the trade talks. So I think that there's good reason to believe that we could reach a deal in the trade negotiation regardless of these other factors. But there are also reasons why we may not be as close to a deal as is speculated.
We're going to talk to you about some of the other, factors as you mentioned a bit later. To you, I want to do a survey also about that. Mr. Rubin, what do you think? Do you think people can really concentrate on trade and economic issues separate from all the other very complicated issues?
Well, the trade issue is very complicated in and of itself, but certainly these other issues are not going away. And the longer that the trade talks persist without resolution, the more that these other issues come into the front of the line, so to speak, here in Washington in terms of the discussion about China. And I think that linkage is possible. You hear it on Capitol Hill. You hear members of Congress raising the bar for what they would view as an acceptable deal with China, and certainly the issues of human rights towards Uyghurs and towards Hong Kong. These are issues that are not going away anytime soon here in Washington. So China to get a clean deal without those issues addressed is going to be harder by the day.
And of course, China, Mr. Yang, sees all the other issues, the so-called human rights issues mentioned by the other party, in a very different light. And we wouldn't debate about those issues because today we're supposed to, right now, concentrate on the trade and economic issues. But do you think China will be able to concentrate on the trade talks while all the other complicated issues are also going on between China and the United States right now?
Well, that is China's hope. What you said is really China's hope. Say, separate the trade disputes. Trade disputes is reality. And the right tactics and the policy for both sides is separate these complicated disputes from the more wider range of complicated issues like human rights and other even security issues. Only by doing that, then the complicated trade disputes can be solved on equal footing. Unfortunately, now we haven't reached that ideal shape, say, separate the issue from the other. Then we are now experiencing a very strange but quite bad situation, say, the tail wags the dog rather than the dog wags the tail. Say, the individual trade negotiation always wags the whole bilateral relation. That should be the case. So we both sides should try the joint efforts to separate the trade issue from the others.
Well, probably you are putting too much hope on Washington and Beijing right now. As we know, there's an election season going on. There are many other complicated domestic political issues as well. Mr. Liu, Professor, what do you think? I want to do this survey among the four of you.
Yes.
What's your sense?
Well, at the moment, it's not really very much entangled with the trade talks because there has been intensified communication between the negotiators on both sides. But in the meantime, those human rights issues does really add fuel to some of the negative sentiment when both parties are really pointing fingers at the other. You know, one says, "Oh, that's my domestic affair," and the other will say, "Oh, human rights is really universal." And the worst situation that facts are not really being commonly recognized. So therefore, it really leads to a lot of confusion to the world.
Ms. Ashton, it's not the first time that during a debate when fact is pretty free from being mentioned. But I want to go to you about that because you are representing the business community. That is really the hard dollar and the RMB that we are talking about right here. The more the trade discussions without any result continues, the more likely the business community from both sides and very much also the bigger economic prospects of the two economies are also likely to be hampered. So how do you think, what would be the factor that would come out and would be able to convince both sides that there needs to be a little fence at least being built to separate the trade discussion with the other more than complicated and certainly would not be quickly resolved issues?
Sure. So I think that so far the fence has been in place pretty well between the U.S. presidential administration and the Chinese side, the two negotiating teams. I think where there isn't a fence, as Mr. Rubin mentioned, is on the Hill. And the Hill doesn't have a direct role in the trade negotiations, but the Hill does have the ability to pass legislation that can have pretty significant commercial impacts. So even if the legislation is aimed at addressing, perceived human rights issues or national security issues, it still can have very significant impacts on both sides' economies in terms of its ability to impact how the two sides can do business together or cannot.
Yeah. Mr. Rubin, you know better than most of us as to how Washington works because you served earlier in the administration, one of those administrations. And certainly the Hill is a very complicated place because politicians from all kinds of perceptions and purposes are there. They do things for their own agenda most of the time, in the names of their constituency, of course. So that might not necessarily would put them together to look at a much bigger picture, whether it's the U.S. economy or the U.S.-China relations. So, Mr. Rubin, do you think, though, it will be the Hill that eventually will have a say and a deciding factor on this U.S.-China relations, particularly regarding trade discussions, or the administration which is holding on still? Go ahead.
Yes. No, I mean, it's a fair point and question, but Capitol Hill, we have to remember, reflects the popular will of the American people, as does the president. And this president ran on an agenda of getting tough on trade with China because the American people, in his estimation, did not support the status quo. And in fact, there was a lot of support and is a lot of support for what he's doing in the Democratic Party. So he's really not on his own politically. Now, for Capitol Hill, a lot of the pressure that we're talking about related to human rights also reflects the American political view, but the popular view about concerns about Hong Kong and about the Uyghurs that are not going away anytime soon. And the president initially threatened to veto legislation related to Hong Kong, but knew that he would be overridden in his veto, so he signed it. And so Capitol Hill, it has ultimate authority over trade. Congress is the one that governs trade according to the Constitution. So the Congress can very easily step in, and China has to find a way to build some positive political will with Capitol Hill if any trade deal is going to actually advance once it's signed into law. And that's a big blind spot right now in these negotiations.
But there are also suspicions, Mr. Yang, that
Sure.
it is really that the current administration wants to have a deal between China and the United States about trade. Given its political situation back at home and also for the next election. It is also, as a result of the next election, or building up to the next election, that some politicians in Washington certainly do not want to see a trade deal between China and the United States right now. So it's a very complicated issue. So how is Beijing looking at the various facets of Washington being reflected right now in all of these dramas going on?
Well, for Beijing's point of view, the counterpart from the other side, say the United States, now is not a single unified negotiator with Chinese negotiator. The negotiator from American side is mixed by both economic consideration, business consideration, and very complicated but wide range of political considerations with their specific interesting groups. For example, the advertisement, the activists on human rights focus on what they are interested in, rather than trade imbalance or trade deficit, whatever. While the main player of the government really focus on how to rebalance the deficit so that they can contribute to the campaign. So different focal points composed a very complicated negotiating team, both including player in the front line and invisible player behind the scene. So such a complicated counterpart really make the situation very complicated. That is one of the reasons why the negotiation now is going forward in very difficult shape.
Is it fair to ask China to deal with all of this?
No. If you're really concerned and interested in the trade deficits, let's go to business to talk about the deficit. Exclude the other matters. For example, many Americans say, oh, Hong Kong issue is also important. But what if I say homeless crisis in California is more important? And should the Chinese peace conference pass a resolution about homeless or about impeachment or about illegal immigration in the United States? If that is the case, I think American Capitol Hill is setting a mode or set of rules for international community. Say, if U.S. behavior becomes universal rule, then every sovereign state have the right to dictate the other states. Then we will fall in the mess.
Interesting perspective. Professor Liu?
May I comment on
yeah,
that?
Yeah, I'll let Professor Liu go first, and then I'll come back to some of you. Yeah.
Yes,
please,
please.
For
Professor
that,
Liu.
I think we need to clarify, which I really do agree with Ms. Ashton, is that right now we have to separate the other human rights issues, other messy issues, from the trade negotiation, because from the U.S. side, even, human rights issue is not really in the negotiation agenda, and because legally the negotiators are granted with the 301 and 232, so there is a legal base on that. So going beyond that, that's something probably happening in the future, but not at the moment. So far, I think the negotiation is still in the right trajectory as how we can really prevent distortive practices in international trade. So we have to make clear on that point.
Fascinating. Ms. Ashton has been nodding her head in this regard. I'll let her comment briefly before I go to you, Mr. Rubin. Ms. Ashton, please, and then Mr. Rubin, and then I come back to Mr. Yang. Please, go ahead.
I guess just to refocus a little bit, I think that it's worth looking at the misunderstandings that may exist in the relationship purely to do with trade. So for instance, I think that there may be a perception that the U.S. is anxious for a deal, and in some ways that's true. I think that the president ran on getting a better deal with China and a more fair trade relationship, and so he would like to deliver that. I think that he knows that his agricultural constituency is hurting, and he knows that the business community is hurting. But at the same time, I don't think that the tariffs have yet hit the pocketbooks of average Americans in a way that they are recognizing as significant. And until we see perhaps the outcome of the December 15th tariffs, I'm not sure that they are going to be super motivated to see the president reach a deal in the same way that is sometimes portrayed. And then on the Chinese side, I think that we hear the administration say a lot that the tariffs have really hurt the Chinese economy, they've slowed the Chinese economy, and that China is also experiencing a loss of foreign direct investment. But the data doesn't support that. The data supports that even though exports to the United States have gone down significantly, China's exports to the world in general have gone up. And so its exports are pretty flat. And then on the FDI side, while there may be a decrease in U.S. FDI, in reality, China's share of global FDI is growing. So both sides have reasons why they are motivated for a deal, but at the same time, the pressure could certainly be higher.
And of course, at this moment, we do not even know what would happen on December 15th, even though we heard some of the, rhetorics and messages coming from both sides. So let me go to you, Mr. Rubin, and then after that, Mr. Yang. Mr. Rubin, please.
Thank you. And I want to just remark about the political context here in Washington, which is that the United States is never going to refrain, certainly not Congress, from commenting on, for example, Hong Kong, which also touch on issues of sovereignty and democracy and America's position in a global level. And so expecting that to not have commentary is unrealistic. But I do think also we have many examples of the United States negotiating agreements with foreign powers while criticizing them, and I don't think that China should necessarily take that as an affront. It's possible to walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say, and for the United States to have views about behaviors by China in the region and still have a good, hard-fought negotiation. Those are not, it's not one or the other.
Well, Mr. Yang?
Well, I think the differences between U.S. and China on the Hong Kong issue and Xinjiang issue touches on a very basic principle of international relations that is set in the 17th century, say Westphalia, based on Westphalia treaties. That set the principle, say, equality of sovereignty. And for U.S. behaves that U.S. as a one sovereign state, they have the right to interfere the other sovereign states' internal affairs. If that is the rule, if that is the international rule, replace the Westphalia Treaty, then we will have a more instable or chaos world. Say every sovereign state have the right to interfere each other.
See? This is what we're talking about. That when you talk about trade, we still cannot be just talking about
China,
trade.
I'm sorry, I have to say this.
I try to focus the attention
it's not as
on
if China
trade.
is not engaged or interfering in its neighbors.
All right. Thank you so much for all of you. I think we see so many different perspectives in this discussion. And we hope things, particular rhetorics, can be thrown away when the negotiators are really sitting down together to have some final result, if there could be some final result for the first round of the negotiation. Thank you so much. Earlier, Anna Ashton, Joe Rubin in the US, and also Yang Xiyu, Liu Baocheng here in Beijing. Thank you, really appreciate it.